And what we're seeing is that win rates for companies that invest in community and invest in meaningful, authentic in-person experiences, as opposed to just trade shows, win rates for sort of trust-based interactions, which is effectively what community represents, are much, much higher. And so if you're thinking about how do you grow, I think that this is probably a pretty salient topic, because in a world of AI noise where even everything is clearly written or contributed by some kind of Gen AI or LLM, the way that people are winning the most interesting deals at the highest rate is in places like community. And again, I think the underlying theme is trust, is where can you build a real meaningful relationship with another human being? So to the extent anybody on the call is thinking about growth and thinking about hitting their revenue targets and building pipeline, I think this is a worthwhile conversation, whether you start your own community or whether you invest in other communities which may exist. So let's start with some misconceptions, and then we can talk about what makes, when they work, and how communities, when they work, what makes them work. You can imagine what on the screen is the inverse is obviously going to be what makes them work. But I think the biggest thing that I want to underscore for community is it is it's closer to a brand investment than a demand generation investment. And what I mean by that is brand is a long-term demand generation investment. A lot of founders and CEOs struggle with brand because we're all used to hitting monthly or quarterly revenue targets. We're presenting to people like Tony every quarter in the board meeting, and it's imperative that we deliver those results. At the same time, we can't not invest in brand, because over the long term, brand is what creates trust, which is what creates improvements through our funnel in terms of conversion rates. And ultimately, it's it's a long-term demand generation. Community is very similar. You have to approach it from a perspective of not taking a short-term view, but taking a long-term view. The more you try to tweak it to be a near-term demand generation engine, the more likely you are to make some mistakes, because the essence of community, again, using that word that you'll hear me say a lot today, is trust. And if you treat all of the participants, as it says on the screen, like a growth channel, if you immediately try to sell to people, if you have your account executives or your salespeople join, and Pavilion's not the only one, there's lots of communities out there. If you have them join these communities simply to prospect, you're doing some damage to your brand. You're eroding trust, and it's not really going to work as well. The funny thing about communities is if you invest in them with a longer term perspective, which is basically the idea articulated on the screen, if you invest in them from a retention perspective, from a trust-based perspective, they tend to deliver very meaningful results. If you treat them as demand generation channel, a wet t-shirt to be squeezed, to be wrung dry, then ultimately you're gonna do yourself some short shrift. So I think fundamentally, you should think about any investments, again, whether you're putting your own people into like relevant ICP communities, or whether you're building your own, which is a very good strategy. But the people that build their own take a very long-term view, and they sell not by selling, but by being helpful and supportive to the members, which sounds a little woo, a little loosey-goosey, but it really is the thing that makes the meaningful difference. If you have long-term goals, and you can have long-term goals around pipeline generation, but if you have long-term goals, they tend to work. If you have short, near-term goals, I didn't get one good lead from this community, I've been saying hi to people for 20 days or 30 days, ultimately that perspective is what's not going to help you and serve you very well. So also, I think to the extent that it's important, there's a big difference between audience and community. And I think there's lots and lots of people that assume that the accumulation of a set of emails and sending a newsletter is community. And as a purist, I suppose, I would say that my perspective is that if it's one-to-many communication where you're communicating your ideas but not receiving anything in return, that is not a community, that's an audience. By the way, audiences are great, but communities are really interesting and more powerful when the participants talk to themselves. You know that you have a community when you don't actually have to moderate every single conversation, but when members of the community are connecting with each other to support and help each other. And that's really the key difference. There's other things that you see on the screen, but I think the other way that it's a community is, do the members themselves identify as being members of the community? If I get somebody's newsletter, that doesn't mean that I self-identify as being part of their community. It only means it's only a community for me if I'm interacting with other participants and I self-identify as, in my case, a Pavilion member. So that's important because the stance that you take and the asks that you make of people are going to emerge from how you treat them and whether you view them as an audience, meaning it is their job to consume your ideas, or whether you treat them or view them as a community where it's really your job to create a space, whether digital or in person, where they can interact with each other and trust that by so doing, you are building your own brand as a facilitator of those connections. And that's candidly that's how Pavilion emerged. I think what on the screen is really the big message, I would say, which is it's a retention engine, and it's a retention engine because of the identity that you are capable of helping establish and build for members. And what that means, again, all of this in the same way that content marketing, especially ungated content marketing, was in some ways revolutionary. Maybe that's an aggressive word, but it was uncommon. And it was uncommon because ungated content marketing, to the point of Tony publishing, what we're about to talk about on the Mucker blog in a couple of days, ungated content marketing is a gift to the market without requiring anything in return. And if you are a traditional short-term focused demand generation marketer, that might be a big problem for you because you have near-term pipeline targets. But the benefit is that you establish trust. And over time, that you can convert that trust into all the things that drive your business, like revenue, like pipeline and retention. But it just takes a little bit longer, and it takes a perspective that you're not going to be transactional in the relationship. Community, when done well, does all of those things as well. It's very similar, right?